The Sega Mega Drive, or Sega Genesis, is a console well remembered for its fantastic library of games and massive success. In North America, the Genesis ended up becoming Nintendo's first true competitor, even overtaking their market share in 1993. Meanwhile, in most of Europe, the system's predecessor, the Master System, was already the biggest home console on the market, so the Mega Drive's success was pretty much guaranteed. But what about its home country, Japan? Well, that's a different story. That all starts with its horrendous launch in the year that followed it. So sit back, relax, and let me tell you about the disastrous launch of the Mega Drive in Japan. But before we begin, I want to thank Ray Romano. Thank you. For me to truly paint you the picture of what state Sega was in when they launched the Mega Drive in Japan, I have to take you back to the Genesis, the real genesis of Sega's entrance into the console market, the SG-1000. The story goes that Sega had a pretty middling year in arcades in 1982, so they decided to branch out into the computer market. But upon hearing that arcade game rival Nintendo was going to make a computer dedicated to letting families play video games on TVs, they decided to also use that computer hardware for a video game console. Yup. Sega's entire reason for entering the video game console market in the first place was pretty much just to compete with Nintendo. After the SG-1000 and Nintendo's family computer, or Famicom, along with Sega's computer, which became the SC-3000, released on the same day on July 15, 1983, Sega was actually doing pretty well against Nintendo in that first year. Their launch lineup was much better and more diverse than Nintendo's, and many of Nintendo's Famicom units had to be returned because they were suffering from hardware issues. Nintendo was struggling. However, one weak spot that Sega's console had was that its hardware paled in comparison to the Famicom's. The SG-1000 used hardware that basically rendered it a slightly weaker version of the ColecoVision, if you know what that's like. Meanwhile, the Famicom's architecture was heavily based on the Galaxian-derived hardware that helped power most of the popular Japanese arcade games at the time, including Nintendo's own games that they were porting to the system. So it consistently had much better and more accurate arcade ports than Sega's console. Except for Space Invaders, which was the other way around for some reason. And yes, I know I'm oversimplifying things. But the real nail in the coffin for Sega would be hammered in on July 20th, 1984. When something would happen that would cost Sega the console war and help boost Nintendo to the top. Two games, both ports of computer games, released for the Famicom, Lode Runner and Nuts and Milk. These were just like any other Famicom game that came beforehand, except with one major difference. They were published by another company, Hudson Soft. Then on September 7th, the biggest arcade developer at the time would release a self-developed and self-published port of one of their biggest arcade hits to the Famicom, as Namco released Galaxian. The significance of these releases is always significantly downplayed, as this may be the most important thing to ever happen in video game console history, as it's pretty much why they still exist at all. These weren't games produced by finding some way to reverse engineer their way onto the system like every other third-party console game that came before. These publishers signed licensing contracts with Nintendo, allowing both parties to benefit from these releases. This ensured that Nintendo would have the best versions of all of the greatest arcade hits on their system and be able to profit alongside these third parties, and also create some stability for the platform. But despite Nintendo eventually beating out Sega by a ridiculously wide margin, the SG-1000 sold more than what Sega had predicted. So they decided to move forward and start again with a new console. So in 1985, Sega released their second console, the Mark III. Trust me, it makes sense. It's named that because there was an SG-1002 released the year before that was pretty much just a different model of the first. This system had the chance to be a real competitor to the Famicom. It was more powerful and games were relatively cheap to produce for it. While the Famicom was entering its peak, Sega could have diverted attention away from the Famicom, and all they needed to do was try to attract third-party publishers. But Sega still chose to not open up their platform. While they always allowed third-party developers to work with them, in fact, some of the SG-1000 launch titles were some of the first games developed by Compile, who you may know best for Puyo Puyo, and they did publish ports of some of the most popular arcade games that they attained the licenses to. Not having the actual original companies behind these games publishing them left people disinterested. Sega Galaga isn't real Namco Galaga, so who cares? Keep in mind, this was only in Japan. In the rest of the world, the Mark III's international counterpart, the Master System, allowed third parties to publish titles on the system, seemingly starting with the release of Parker Brothers' Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego in 1988. This possibly wasn't all Sega's fault either. Supposedly, and I do mean supposedly, as despite how widespread this piece of information is, I can't find super concrete proof of this, Nintendo forbade publishers from publishing, though not releasing, the same game on competing systems through exclusivity deals. And while there's proof Nintendo of America did this, I can't find any actual concrete evidence that they did this in Japan. However, regardless of the fact that Nintendo may have signed exclusivity deals with all of the biggest companies before anyone else could, Sega still should have at least tried to round up any third-party support they could, and they didn't. So I think they still deserve some of the blame here. One company, even with as much diverse talent as Sega, could not provide enough variety to compete with the Famicom. Even if Nintendo beating them to the punch really didn't help, they didn't even bother sweeping up any of the crumbs of third-party support that weren't swept up by Nintendo. This would, however, change towards the very end of the Mark III's life though, when they finally opened up their platform, and 2 games were released in 1988 by a company called Salio. Those being Solomon no Kagi and Argos no Jujikin, 2 Tecmo games. The true nature of this company has been speculated upon for years, and it's believed that it was somehow a part of Tecmo. And despite them initially being created to publish games for the Mark III, they did publish games for other systems. These 2 games were the only third-party published games for the system in Japan, as support for the system would end shortly after. But despite the Mark III and Mark IV, which was the release of the Master System remodel in Japan, having pretty good libraries, they couldn't compete with Nintendo in Japan. But Sega was Nintendo's only real competition in Japan at the time, as they were willing to commit to their systems and were quite prolific in spite of this. All of the other Japanese companies who rushed to make video game consoles in 1983 and 1984 either ended support for their systems really quickly or just trailing behind Sega. But that all changed in 1987. When a new company entered the market and started making a much bigger impact than Sega ever did. That would of course be computer company NEC with the release of the PC Engine. NEC isn't really what made this console a smash though. It was their collaboration with Hudson Soft that really brought attention to it. The system got so big it outsold the Famicom in 1988, the first time Nintendo was outsold in Japan. NEC was also the first to follow in Nintendo's footsteps of allowing third parties to publish games for the system, with their first third-party release from Namco, Yokai Dochuki, beating Salio's first Master System game by a month. And even though there were quite a few games where Hudson followed in Sega's footsteps of self-publishing a lot of ports of arcade games, they made sure they were accurate and structured a lot of the hardware around being able to do that. So Sega was now third place and barely making an impact on the home console scene in Japan. But when they got word that Nintendo was planning to release a true successor to the Famicom, they began creating their third console, codenamed Mark V, by taking Master System hardware and adding elements of their System 16 arcade board. Of course, this would become the Mega Drive. However, Sega feared that Nintendo was going to release their Super Famicom in early 1989, so they rushed out the system for release on October 29, 1988 to beat them to the market. Never heard of Sega doing something like that before. The system launched with 2 games. Now this isn't a bad thing on its own, its 2 competitors both launched with 2 games. But the 2 games they launched with were embarrassments to the system. And this isn't just my opinion, but we'll get there. Those 2 games being Space Harrier 2 and Super Thunderblade, sequels to Sega's arcade games Space Harrier and Thunderblade. The first problem that's apparent right out of the gate is that they're both the same genre. Not only the same genre, but the same subgenre. So there's a severe lack of variety. But okay, the Famicom launched with an even worse lack of variety, so it isn't that bad. But getting into the actual games themselves, starting with Super Thunderblade, this game is horrible. That's it. In fact, we've peaked early, as this is easily the worst game featured in this video. The awkward helicopter controls that make it hard to dodge and the horrifically choppy frame rate really speak for themselves. The only people who like this game were literally brainwashed into liking it because they or their parents bought it and they had no choice but to play it. It's not that bad if you just get used to it, is the only excuse I'm expecting to hear. You know, one that can be applied to literally every video game ever. Meanwhile, Space Harrier 2 is a bit more competent, it's playable, and it's definitely not a bad game. But as you can see, it's also super choppy. Not so much on its own, but definitely compared to its then 3-year-old predecessor, which was pretty ancient by 1988 standards. I don't hate this game, especially when compared to these other early Mega Drive games, but I completely understand this potentially swaying audiences in 1988 away from the system. The biggest issue with these first 2 games comes down to the hardware not supporting sprite scaling. You know, the trick needed to make Space Harrier and Thunderblade's pseudo 3D gameplay work in the first place. Once again, this system is supposed to be cutting edge, and these titles are supposed to show that off, but they're trying to replicate hardware tricks from 3-year-old arcade games that this new hardware can't even do. It's really sad to see given how many later Mega Drive games did a much better job at imitating scaling and rotation. But those games were made when programmers and artists had a better understanding of the hardware. It just wasn't a good idea to try to push the system's capabilities so much in its launch titles. That being said, it would have been a good move on Sega's part to include sprite scaling as part of the hardware, as they had revolutionized that in the arcades, and the PC Engine hardware didn't support sprite scaling, meaning Sega could have gained a serious competitive advantage here. And I think they would have included this if they didn't rush the system out to beat Nintendo to the market. Though I need to mention that in 2022, a remake of Space Harrier 2 created by M2 was released for the Mega Drive Mini 2 that attempted to fix these issues, and though I've been unable to play it, it looks good. Unfortunately, it's running on an emulated version of fictional hardware M2 made that's basically a Mega Drive with better graphical specs, so these games' extraordinary choppiness is quite ironic for a system that would go on to be marketed around its speed. In fact, despite working under essentially the same limitations, the PC Engine port of Space Harrier that would come out a month and a half later runs so much smoother than Space Harrier 2. Oh yeah, that was another thing that didn't do any favors for Sega's presence in the console market up to that point. The fact that they had licensed out their arcade games to be released to other systems, even well after they were well established in the console market. These games are clearly supposed to be system showcases, but they end up having the opposite effect of making the console look bad. While both of these games are sequels to arcade games rather than ports, neither game even comes close to living up to the standards of their arcade predecessors, and this is most embarrassing in the case of Space Harrier 2, as despite it easily being the best game that the system would receive until late 1989, it still doesn't live up to the standards set by its arcade predecessor that was released in 1985. This game was probably the main reason people bought the system, as its predecessor was hugely successful in Japan and easily Sega's most popular game up to that point, along with Outrun, as despite their lack of success in the home market, they were still huge in arcades. In fact, likely because of hype built around Space Harrier 2, the Mega Drive ended up selling out in 2 days, with 50,000 units sold. So from a sales perspective, this wasn't a disastrous launch, but after those initial 2 days, the system's traction slowed down tremendously for the next few years after that, as it seemed word quickly spread around that the Mega Drive couldn't even live up to the standards of 3-year-old arcade games. Remember, the PC Engine library was already filled with fairly accurate ports of 1987 arcade games at this point, so this was embarrassing. The technically superior PC Engine port of Space Harrier releasing around this same time probably also hurt the Mega Drive's holiday sales. It seemed that the Mega Drive had some hype before its release, but word of mouth soon spread that its games were either underwhelming or awful. Even then, it seems that before the system even released, people were already ambivalent to the games. According to the designer of the system, Hideki Sato, quote, "At the time, we held this huge promotional event. We announced that the 16-bit era had arrived, and we showed off several games. Everybody there was dumbfounded at how bad the games were." So if you thought I was just being harsh to these games, not only did the Japanese public at the time not like them, but the designer of the system himself straight up said that the titles Sega released were, quote, "just no good." It's very obvious that Sega choosing to rush the console out to beat Nintendo wasn't a wise choice and heavily affected the quality of the games. But this decision wasn't the only thing affecting the quality of these games, and Sega's timing was bad regardless of them rushing out the system, as the next game release shows. After nearly 1 long month of the system only having 2 titles, on November 27, 1988, Sega released a port of their arcade game Juoki, or as it's better known in the rest of the world, Altered Beast. Now, I need to get this out of the way. Altered Beast is a very divisive game. I'm nicer to it than a lot of people, but I still think it has a really major problem. A lot of people like to call it a graphics over gameplay game, including this port for some godforsaken reason, and I don't really agree with that. The arcade version plays really well. I mean, there's a shockingly low number of side-scrolling 2-player beat-em-ups out there, and it does a pretty good job at being that, though I may be biased because this is one of the only co-op games I've ever beaten with somebody. My problem with this game is its horrifically underdeveloped concept. You go around collecting a certain number of Sega Saturn logos from beating up one specific type of enemy so you can turn into a beast. And the stage won't progress until you do that, and the beast is specific to each stage. It's got an inkling of a good idea there, but the execution is terrible. Why can't I be whatever beast I want in whatever stage? Why is there no interesting challenge to collecting these Sega Saturn logos? Why is it that in 2-player mode, both players have to become a beast? I mean, I haven't really thought of my own solutions to these problems, but the game is very limiting in an unfun way. But speaking of this port specifically, It's despised in Japan. To give you an example, it was rated the 41st worst Mega Drive game out of what was then all 520 released Mega Drive games, including Mega CD and 32X games, in a 1995 issue of the Japanese Sega Saturn magazine by the magazine's readers, with an average score of 4.6. With the first two releases, you could just say they were rough because they were trying to be 3D games. It would probably be better for Sega to attempt to replicate a pretty simple 2D game on the Mega Drive. And Sega tried just that with this game, attempting to replicate the experience of the title, which had only come out in arcades in June of the same year. Hudson Soft had been accurately porting months-old arcade games to the PC Engine for the past year, and Sega needed to live up to that kind of standard to compete, and unfortunately, they didn't. The problems begin immediately when you start the game up, as Zeus has been shrunken down and appears to have jaundice.
Rise from your grave.
Graphically, it's leagues behind the arcade version. Not only that, it just feels worse to play in ways I can't explain. Weirdly though, this version was fairly well received when it came to the Sega Genesis. The graphical downgrade can easily be explained by one thing. Just like how the system lacks hardware support for sprite scaling, it has another far more egregious hardware shortcoming. The Mega Drive can only support 4 palettes of 16 colors each on screen at one time, or up to 64 colors. That doesn't sound too bad until you consider that the PC Engine could display up to 482 colors on screen at once. As a kid, I always wondered why so many Genesis games looked so gray and brown and sad and thought it was a stylistic choice. But now I know that the style probably wasn't much of a choice. That being said, with this consideration in mind, it's quite impressive what the system would later manage to do. I think this color issue when compared to the PC Engine is comparable to how later, when Sega found out that the Super Nintendo technologically exceeded the Genesis in every way except for its processor speed, they began playing into it with their advertising.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't.
The Mega Drive was technologically superior to the PC Engine in nearly every way except this aspect, and once again, it gave the system a bad look, literally. But the color limitations weren't the only technical issue that affected this port's quality. Going back to Hideki Sato, he said, quote, "For Altered Beast, I wanted to use the same large amount of memory as the System 16 arcade version. In that case, it would have been much better. However, when you significantly reduce the memory, the end result is not good." This happened with 3 or 4 titles. See, Sega's timing wasn't just bad because they rushed the system out. They were also unlucky enough to release it at the same time as a worldwide memory chip shortage. Sega, already struggling at the time, decided to play it safe when it came to memory, and thus developers' ambitions were crushed by Sega's need to have the games out on shelves, regardless of whether or not the games were actually made the way the developers wanted them to be made. As for my theory on what those 3 or 4 games Sato mentioned were, while I think it clearly affected almost every game from the Mega Drive's first year, one he's referring to is obviously Altered Beast, another is one I'll get to in a moment, and another was their big RPG that they released in early 1989, Phantasy Star 2. The sequel to the Master System game. As a kid, I always wondered why this game was so grindy, and when I later played the first Phantasy Star, I wondered why the sequel was such a step backwards. Phantasy Star 1 is less grindy, the characters, in a 1987 JRPG mind you, are more well developed story-wise throughout the game, and you can explore 3 planets with a substantial amount of things to do in them. In Phantasy Star 2, you spend 75% of the game on one fairly barren planet, and spoilers for a nearly 40-year-old game, one of the 3 original planets gets destroyed as part of the plot and you never visit it. But the game is extraordinarily grind-heavy, clearly as a way to cover up how little actual substance there is. As soon as I learned about this memory shortage situation, this game's issues immediately made sense to me. It's a shame really, because similarly to Final Fantasy II, I really love the dark themes and overall vibe here and wish it was more fleshed out. It's a shame that the time they decided to finally remake this game, it was mostly unchanged aside from the graphics. What I want to play is that cover. Tons of plans for this game had to be scrapped, and it's a shame that Sega will never take a chance on any remake of this game, given how little they value their original RPG franchise in comparison to their others, especially the original series. But hey, at least it has the best soundtrack from the first year of the Mega Drive, which, fun fact, was altered in the English versions, making the snare sound noticeably quieter. I have no idea why this one change was made, but it's funny to me for some reason. Anyways, it's clear that this memory shortage heavily impacted the quality of the first year of Mega Drive games to the point that not only were sequels to 3-year-old arcade games not living up to the standards set by their predecessors, but neither were sequels to Master System games. It's also the reason so few games came out before the 1988 holiday season. Only 4. In fact, let's talk about the last of them and probably the most infamous Mega Drive game in Japan, Osomatsu-kun Hachamecha Gekijo. This was a licensed game based on a popular manga from the 1960s. The story is that our protagonist, Osomatsu-kun's brothers, have been kidnapped and taken to strange worlds by his bullies. It's really hard to explain just how bad this game is, since for most of my playtime I just wailed around doing nothing. But the main complaints involve its terrible controls, rather obtuse design meant to make up for its overall lack of content, and its numerous bugs that cause the game to freeze. That being said, it was easily the best looking game for the system until 1990, but this was that other game that was heavily impacted by the memory shortage. It was originally advertised as being a 4 megabit cartridge, but it ended up being released as a 2 megabit cartridge, and players were very upset by the lack of content. And upon the release of a map for the game, they learned it could be beaten in under 7 minutes. If any speedrunners watch my videos, consider this a recommendation. This game's development was really hectic, with half of the original concept having to be scrapped due to the memory shortage. It was developed by an already busy R&D 2 in only 2 months, and the original manga's creator, who infamously hated video games and thought they were contributing to the degeneracy of Japan's youth, allegedly got angry and threw an ashtray at one of the game's developers. This game went down as a pretty infamous kusuge, or crap game in Japan, and really eviscerated the Mega Drive's reputation, causing Sega to have to slowly heal from its effects for the next 4 years. The Mega Drive was released a whole 2 years before the Super Famicom, and aside from its minor hardware shortcomings, it had the ability to compete with the PC engine. But those 2 years on the market were also the reason it had such bad games due to it being rushed at an unfortunate time. All of 1988 for the Mega Drive was marked by controversy. But while things got slightly better in 1989, the troubles still persisted. Sega began the year by releasing Alex Kidd Tenku Majo and Phantasy Star 2, 2 sequels to Master System games that clearly didn't live up to the standards of their predecessors, especially Alex Kidd, which was truly awful, and Sega would retire that series shortly after its release. This is a huge shame because the game it was following up was easily the best Master System game. That made for 6 games with major issues in a row. But making matters worse would be the situation regarding what was supposed to be Sega's big game of April that would have been the one to break the streak of bad games. A port of one of their biggest arcade games that actually lives up to its standards and would have released precisely before any competition would have taken their shine. That game, of course, being Tetris. If you're unaware of the legal situation regarding Tetris, literally just watch the Gaming Historian's video on the subject. It's easily the best researched and put together resource for people to understand it. But to put it simply, a bunch of companies had bought the rights to Tetris from people who didn't actually own Tetris. Sega believed that through licensing the game from Tengen, they had the right to release the game to arcades and the Mega Drive. However, upon finding out that they actually didn't have the rights, they canceled shipments of the Mega Drive version, losing lots of potential money and time from attempting to produce the game. Luckily, while they didn't have console rights, Sega was allowed to keep the arcade rights. But this situation was yet another blow to Sega, and I'm honestly shocked they were able to recover from this. Softening the blow somewhat is the fact that they outsourced actual development of the game to Sanritsu Denki, so it didn't take any time away from in-house developers' projects. In June, the thing Sega needed this entire time finally happened when a third-party title came out for the Mega Drive, Thunder Force 2 by PC developer Technosoft, a port of their Sharp X68000 computer game, and actually a pretty good one. In fact, Sato believed it was the first worthwhile game for the system, stating, quote, "When I saw that game, I finally felt relieved that I hadn't been so wrong in the design of the architecture. Up to that point, the titles Sega had put out were worthless." It's very clear that when it came to third parties, Sega was looking to attract PC developers in order to take some of that market away from the PC engine, as NEC was a computer manufacturer, which was a rare good move on their part. They really wanted to correct their past mistakes and prioritize third parties, though they were slow to get on board with the system at first, either because they were already on the PC engine or still loyal to Nintendo. But at least Sega themselves were actually trying this time. This ended up attracting the attention of the big publishers who would slowly start supporting the Mega Drive in the years to come. And to no one's shock, the Mega Drive, despite not being that much of a success, slowly ended up becoming much more successful than Sega's previous consoles largely because of this. Who would have thought? Unfortunately, by the time Sega was starting to pick up traction and the system started to become a real competitor to the PC engine, their real rival, the reason they rushed the system out and entered the console business at all, released a system that was superior in both hardware and support, as Nintendo released the Super Famicom in November of 1990. Meanwhile, the complete opposite situation was going on in the US, and the odds were completely stacked in Sega of America's favor. When the Mega Drive, renamed to the Sega Genesis, launched in August of 1989, it had not only beaten its only potential competitor, the TurboGrafx-16, the American version of the PC Engine, to the market, Sega had made the smart decision to attain the licenses to multiple celebrities for their sports games, penetrating a very mainstream casual market in the process. They were also lucky to have the better 1990 games come so close to launch, but their biggest lucky break came because Sonic the Hedgehog, the game that pushed them over the edge, was fortunate enough to have released months before the Super Nintendo's worldwide release, and they were able to firmly establish themselves as Nintendo's main rival and succeed, despite the hardware being outdated, through competitive pricing. Meanwhile, in Japan, the Super Famicom came too fast for even the fastest hedgehog in the world, and the game and character never became the cultural icon in its home country like in the rest of the world, not even being the best-selling Mega Drive game over there. Though it did gain a fair bit of interest amongst Mega Drive owners, probably thanks to its overseas success and how much Sega was trying to push it. But it wasn't even the system seller. That would be its later arcade ports, particularly Puyo Puyo, and its RPGs. So here's where I get into why I decided to make this video. About a year ago, I decided I wanted to at least check out every Japanese Mega Drive game in release order, since it was one of the consoles I was already most familiar with, having played about a quarter of the library. And I found its pretty much untold Japanese history fascinating. It often gets left out of what I consider to be the big trio of consoles that have a very different history in Japan versus the rest of the world. Those being the Famicom and NES, PC Engine and TurboGrafx-16, and Sega Saturn. I consider the first simply because it's so different, and the latter two because they were so much more successful in Japan. But the Mega Drive is the opposite. It didn't make the same cultural impact, though it ultimately would become a little bit more popular late in its life, probably because curious gamers in Japan knew of the system's success in the West and wanted to check it out for that reason, which became a big selling point for the system in Japan circa 1995, late in its life, which was simultaneously marked by a flurry of Western releases, and it became a cheap alternative to its competitors. However, it only sold over 3 million units in Japan. While that doesn't sound that bad, that was less than half of what the PC Engine sold, which itself was less than half of what the Super Famicom sold. Now, I never ended up playing every Japanese Mega Drive game, but through my attempt, I noticed how strangely awful most of the early games were, which I correctly assumed was why the console was so unpopular in Japan. So I dug deeper and everything started to make sense. The Mega Drive's lack of popularity in its home country versus the rest of the world explains why so many Mega Drive era franchises, even the most popular and prolific one, get so mistreated by Sega today. It's their most popular piece of history overseas, so they have to bank on that. Yet it's clear that in Japan, they don't quite understand its cultural impact because it never had much of one there. But despite its rough start and relative lack of success, the Mega Drive is looked upon fondly in Japan. In the end, I think there are 5 reasons why the Mega Drive failed to catch on in Japan, beyond bad games, because these reasons were the cause of the bad games. I know ending the video with a list sounds like how someone who uses ChatGPT for scripts would conclude their video, but I genuinely had to group everything into a list so I could figure out how to sprinkle these points throughout the video. So here are these reasons, from smallest to biggest. Though first I want to give quick honorable mentions to the fact that A, they still had developers working on Master System games at this point, most of which wouldn't even see release in Japan, which pointlessly diverted developers' much needed attention away from their new console, and B, how they still license their games out for other publishers to release on competing systems, a practice that they wouldn't really cease until 1991, when they began realizing the importance of having killer apps and shut down development of an Amiga port of their biggest one. Number 5. The PC Engine came first. Not that big of a deal, admittedly, but they really struggled to compete early on and didn't have anything better or different from what it was offering until late 1989. Number 4, the hardware shortcomings. This is related to my last point. Outside of Osomatsu-kun and Phantasy Star 2, none of these early Mega Drive games even look remotely as good as PC Engine games. A huge part of this came from how rushed it was, with Sato having stated that he wished he could have included more of the System 16 hardware's features in the console. That, at the very least, would have helped the port of Juoki. Number 3, Tetris getting cancelled. Given how Puyo Puyo would become the system's biggest success 3 years later, I can only imagine how big their Tetris port would have been, especially considering it was much better than the Famicom version available at the time and would have beaten the Game Boy version to the market. A lot of people probably planned on picking up a Mega Drive just for that game and reeled back when it was cancelled. But the Mega Drive sadly wouldn't see other similar puzzle games until a year later, and they didn't get one out in time for that holiday season. Tetris probably would have been enough to wash out the bad taste that the first 6 games left in people's mouths. But alas, it turns out it was just a waste of time and resources that they could have spent elsewhere. Number 2, the chip shortage. For as much crap as I can give Sega for making knowingly bad decisions, this one I can excuse them for, as I don't think they foresaw this. At the same time though, this started happening before the console released, and Nintendo pulled the better move by delaying theirs because of it. I guess Sega was doing so bad they couldn't afford to do that. And that leads to my last point. Number 1. Rushing the console out to beat Nintendo. This caused problem number 4, and not only did this cause the games to be rushed messes as well, it gave Nintendo a strategic advantage in the ability to not only make a more powerful machine, but to let third-party publishers hold off until their system released. Sega thought being first was more important than being better. It's very clear from researching their Japanese console history that Sega's rivalry with Nintendo was always one of their biggest weak points. However, as much as it was a weak spot, it was also a strong suit. It helped them keep going, and the competition helped elevate video games as an art form. And I think it was more than the marketing war people paint it to be. I think the best example of this is how Sonic tried to compete with Mario. Once upon a time, they were actually trying to attract a wider demographic than Mario, not by just telling you it was cooler than Mario with no substance. There was a completely genuine attempt by the developers themselves, not just a marketing team. Sonic was actually trying to compete with Mario and Nintendo mostly by being even more accessible, whether that be through the gameplay mechanics or how it presented itself, like how the lack of excess text made the games accessible to everyone as they were regardless of language. Something that some may chalk up to a product of limitations, but it really wasn't. And it wasn't like it was just trying to be a better Mario, it still carved out its own unique identity from the beginning. The extent to which these games succeeded at this is up to you, but it was still something. I know that so many people from underserved regions who otherwise wouldn't be able to play most video games from this period and always had their region or culture or language ignored by the big game companies were able to find joy and escapism in these games because they were made this way. Unfortunately, it seems like they gave up on holding themselves to this standard and instead switched over to trying to reach that mass audience by cynically checking off checklists of demographics. But despite my cynical view on Sega as a company throughout this video, it must be emphasized that the people who made these games still matter and still need to be recognized and appreciated. After struggling for a while, they were able to go out there and create the games no one else was willing to make. I didn't make this video solely to crap on these games I talk about. I also wanted to showcase their potential. And hopefully you were entertained and learned something from it, as I just find the Japanese side of the Mega Drive really interesting and wanted more attention brought to it. Let me know if you would like to see me cover more Japanese Mega Drive history in the future. If you like this video, I got plenty more like this. I want to give a special thanks to the website MD Shock. They had really good translations of old magazine articles and interviews that were a good resource to use in this video since there's barely any information on the English net about the Japanese side of the Mega Drive. Also, thanks to the website Pico Pico Nintendo, which catalogs Japanese home console games and gave me context as to what the best-selling Mega Drive games in Japan were. I might actually cover some of these best-selling games lists one day if you guys want me to. It's one of the most interesting ways to see the difference between Japan's and the rest of the world's gaming cultures. Special thanks to my patron. I hope you found this video enlightening, and I'm wishing you all a wonderful rest of your day.